afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to another event in the Dublin Festival of History. In a few minutes, I'm going to hand you over to today's speaker, but just in the meantime, I'll introduce myself. I'm Mary Muldowney, and I am one of Dublin City Council's historians in residence. Now, if you haven't been at any other events so far, you may not know that the Dublin Festival of History is an annual free festival. It's been running for quite a few years now, and it's brought to you by Dublin City Council and organised by Dublin City Libraries. But this event is run in partnership with the Dublin Port Company. So in a few minutes, when I hand you over to Eamonn, I'm sure we're going to be fascinated because I've been looking at some of his pictures and they're wonderful. But just to let you know that there will be time for questions at the end. There'll be roughly 15 minutes. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a button labeled Q&A, and you can type questions or comments on that button. And at the end of Eamonn's talk, I will read them out to him and he will respond. We may not be able to get to all of the questions because we do have to finish on the dot of 6 o'clock, but we'll do the best to answer as many as we can. If you're tweeting about the festival, the hashtag is #HistFest2020. Now, our speaker today is Eamonn O'Reilly, and he was appointed Chief Executive of Dublin Port Company in August 2010. And he previously held the position of Chief Executive at Portrose Stevedores, the Dublin Port-based cargo handling business, and he'd been there since 2005. Eamonn also held the role of Group Development Manager of Portrose parent company, Doyle Shipping Group, during that time. He started his career as an engineer with Irish Cement Limited before working overseas in Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the Congo. Eamonn is a chartered engineer, having graduated from University College Dublin, and he holds an MBA from Trinity. He's a member of Engineers Ireland and the current chairman of the European Seaports Organisation, and is also a member of the General Stevedoring Council. My apologies, I caught a heavy cold. I'm afraid my voice is a bit dodgy. So I'm going to hand you over now to Eamonn, and I'll come back to you to great questions at the end of his talk. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mary, and welcome everybody out there. What I want to do this evening is to look at a particular 20 or 25 year period, very formative period in the history of Dublin Port. And the materials we're going to present, it's material we've been working on recently as part of future planning work that we're doing here in Dublin Port. We're starting to look at what needs to be done today in order to have new capacity for 2040, 20 years from now. So as part of looking forward, we looked back, and a lot of the material tonight is going to be based around historical maps, and I'll take you through that. All of the maps are available. We put a website live, Dublin Port post-2040 dialogue.ie, and on that are a number of papers, including one which essentially mirrors what I'm going to be talking about this evening. Mary mentioned I worked in the Congo, so I'm going to start off tonight's talk with the Congo River, and I'll explain why as I go through this. The Congo River is an enormous river draining the center of Africa and pushing this enormous 130-kilometer long surge of water out into the Atlantic Ocean. That surge of water, every single second on average, is about 41,000 tons of water push out, and the effect of that is to create a really deep channel. So there's about 200 meters or 300 meters depth of water at the mouth of the Congo River. Ireland is a very small country. Our rivers are therefore very small, and the Shannon, instead of having 41,000 tons per second, would have about 208. And the River Liffey, where Dublin Port is located, it's a very puny river. It is only 14 tons of water per second. And the effect of that is technology, pardon me for a moment. sorry, the effect of that can be seen in a map dating all the way back to 1704. When you don't have a large volume of water coming out, you inevitably get at the mouth a buildup of a thing called a bar. It's a raised area of silt and sand, and it provides a navigational hazard for shipping into the port. In this map of 1704 by a guy called Captain Thomas Phillips, at the left-hand side here is Essex Bridge, or Grattan Bridge as we now know it. And you can see the channel of the river meanders. And this was what ships in the old days had to negotiate. There is also a kind of a rectilinear shape of channel here, and that's what they were aspiring to achieve in Dublin in the early 1700s. But there was no organization in charge of the river, and what happened then was the citizens got agitated, business got agitated, and there was a piece of legislation passed in 1707, and that was called an Act for Cleansing the Port, Harbour and River of Dublin, and for erecting a ballast office in the said city. And that was an act that gave to Dublin Corporation the power to look after and manage the river in a way it hadn't formally been done before. And that organisation was known as the Ballast Committee. It was all about ballast, ship's ballast. The problem with the channel was not only nature, but it was people taking up material from the bed of the river for ballast in ships, or worse, discharging material back into the channel when they no longer needed ballast, and it all needed to be managed. So this organisation started its work in 1708, and in 1725, here is a survey map by Gabriel Stokes. It's essentially identical to one I just showed you from 1704, but with the changes in those 17 years marked out in red. Now, the most significant thing is that in those 18 years, the ballast office managed to deepen the river by about 4 feet. They also managed to get, and it's said in the top here, to make the river channel several perches wider. So that's maybe 40 feet, 50 feet, something like that. The most significant thing here, though, is probably these red dots. These red dots are the start of the Great South Wall. They were timber quiches. There was a big timber barrier put in by the ballast office to stop sand moving into the channel. So between that and work on the channel, they started to train the channel, and that's what was important. If I jump to the end of that century, in fact, right up to today, what you see is the Great South Wall, built in stone, in granite, for the most part. This replaced those timber quiches, and the original wall, it was enormous. It was 4,800 meters long. Today, when you walk it, you walk a section of about 1.6 kilometers. The rest of it in power stations and storage works and port facilities have all been built on either side of the original wall. It was a phenomenal piece of engineering. But what I want to talk about tonight is the other wall, and that's the North Bowl Wall, built in the course of the 19th century. And this wall is a wall which, parts of which at high tide are submerged, and as the tide goes down, they open up. And the whole idea of these two walls was try to create in Dublin a surge of water, like we saw in the Congo River, which would help to knock that bar and provide a safe channel for ships to come in and out. The first significant thing that happened in respect to that wall happened in 1800. I won't go into this detail, but this is a beautiful survey map made by Captain William Bligh. And the title of it down here is, "At the desire of His Excellent Marquis Cornwallis, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, to the Right Honourable the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty of Great Britain, their Lordships directed this survey of the Bay of Dublin to be taken by Captain William Bligh of the Royal Navy, December 1800. In doing the survey, Bligh recommended that this is the Great South Wall. He recommended the building of a wall parallel to the Great South Wall. I'll come back to this in a moment. But the thing to realise from this is Bligh was not responsible for the North Pole Wall at all. So maybe that's one thing we can lay to rest tonight, and I'll go through that in a bit of detail. In about 1802, Bligh had sent his report to the Admiralty. He had also sent it to the Directors General of Inland Navigation. There was great impatience to get the problem of Dublin Port sorted. So notwithstanding that there was a port authority, which by 1800 had become not the ballast office, it had become the ballast board, as it was known colloquially, an organisation called the Directors General of Inland Navigation were given the task of trying to improve the situation in Dublin Port. And the key thing is, these essentially were canal people. That was what their role was. And the Directors General of Inland Navigation went through a number of mutations, and nowadays it's actually part of the Office of Public Works. But the interesting thing in 1802, in trying to solve the problem of Dublin Port, they had the idea from Captain Bligh of his wall. They also had suggestions from the Port Authority, the forerunner of Dublin Port Company, that's the ballast board I mentioned. They had their own idea about how the problem should be sorted. But very interestingly, the Directors General launched a public consultation in 1802, and these are the opening words from that consultation, the introduction, about an 85-page document. It contained 6 maps, identical maps, except each marked up with the ideas of the various contributors. And these are the contributors to that consultation paper. There was Thomas Hyde Page of the Royal Engineers. He was a real canal man. He had done designs for new docks up at North Lots and had submitted those designs to the Royal Canal Company. There was Captain Bligh, obviously. There was Captain Daniel Corneal, a very important role he plays in this story. And finally, there was John Rennie, the senior, the man responsible for the construction of Dunleary Harbour. And you can see in their introduction, the Directors General request to be favoured with the information and the opinion which the reader may be enabled to form upon these plans from scientific, practical or local knowledge upon the subject. And what we see here in this consultation, I think this is quite like the Children's Hospital. If you cast your mind back over the years, the Children's Hospital should have been co-located. Would it be a Children's Hospital with maternity, with an adult? What site would it be on? Would it be the Mater or James's or Blanchardstown or some other site? I think the situation back in 1802 was very similar to that. There was all kinds of ideas about what should be done to achieve the desired objective, in this case, to solve the problem of Dublin Port. And we will see that now as we go through the consultation. The essence of this consultation document, this is one of the 6 maps, and you can see it's marked up in red at various locations. So these are the ideas of the contributor, in this case, Thomas Hyde Page. And Page, being a canal man, he doesn't show it in this map, but his basic idea was to create, first of all, safe anchorages here at Dalkey Island. So on the south side of Dalkey Island, to throw boulders into the sea, in essence, to build a breakwater in towards Killiney Bay, to run from the northern end of Dalkey Island. Similarly, put in breakwaters to join Lamb Island and Maiden Island. So that would be a safe anchorage for ships. He also talked about building a short pier at Sandy Cove and a bigger pier at sea to create another safe haven. And very similarly on the north side at Howth Head and at Ireland's Eye to put in similar breakwaters. The idea being ships could safely stay there until the conditions were right to get up this very difficult channel we spoke about. Page also had the idea of actually raising parts of the bar to create an island and also putting in embankments. And these are efforts to try to control the current beneficially to help to keep that channel clear. I think the interesting thing, and there's a magic number I should have mentioned at the outset, of £103,055 That was the cost of building the North Bull Wall. Page did the estimates, pardon me, for the works I've just described, and he came to £1.8 million. And for Page, this wasn't a problem. You can see these are his words at the top, not mine. From the papers in this consultation document, he says, notwithstanding the magnitude of the estimate, the object is worth the expenditure. The United Parliament of England and Ireland, and this is just after the Act of Union, obviously, the United Parliament of England and Ireland would not hesitate in voting at least £100,000 a year towards the progressive improvement of the navigation. So Page's solution was 17 times more expensive than was ultimately actually necessary. But even beyond that, he was in favour of running canals from the south side at Sandy Cove, running them into Grand Canal Dock, and from the north side, run them into North Lots. He doesn't put a cost on them. Notwithstanding that, he's still at 1.8 million, which is some sum of money. We then come to my sticky mouse. Sorry, apologies for that. We then come to William Bligh's own solution. So from the solution from a canal man, for whom expenditure was no object, Bligh presents a very different approach. And I think it's very interesting. I think we all know Captain Bligh in a sense from Charles Lawton or Anthony Hopkins in the movies, but you really get a sense reading this consultation document, which, by the way, is available on that website I showed you earlier if you want to have a look at your leisure. Bligh absolutely rubbished the idea of building canals. He said it would be a waste of money. And if we could just find his words, what he says within the papers, I impress it strongly as a principle that a canal and the Liffey would destroy each other, as both would be too burdensome to keep up. So where Page, money was no object, or other people's money was no object, Bligh just saw canals as being a complete waste of money, and if you built them, they'd fall into disuse because you couldn't afford to keep them up. He did agree, obviously, being a mariner, with the idea of safe haven. So he has a little pier suggested here in the vicinity of Dunleary, and he has almost an identical solution proposed at Ireland's Eye and at Howth. But when it comes to the port itself, Bligh had a very simple view. He said the bar is bad, but the harbour is even worse. And in his words, it is the harbour to be complained of and not the bar. So he proposed the most minimal works. He proposed this parallel wall, the only purpose of which was to allow manual labour tidy up the bed of the river and give some additional depth at the berths. Because in his view, there was more depth of water at the bar than at the berths. Therefore, don't worry about the bar, work on the berths. This was a very different approach to Page. To my mind, this was one of the great achievements of Bligh from his contribution to Dublin Port. It was to knock on the head prevailing wisdom of the powers that be, the directors general being canal people, Page and John Rennie, who we'll see shortly, also being canal people. He knocked that on the head. The other great contribution, and this one is, I just love this. Bligh, he was brought in to do a survey to make suggestions, but when he saw a problem, this seems to me to suggest Bligh was a man who didn't see a problem without commenting on it if he could. This is his advice to marine insurers, and I'm going to read through this. We'll come back to this at the end to identify the second big contribution he made. And what Bligh says is, throughout the Bay of Dublin, the bottom is fine sand and the whole bay affords good anchorage from 4 fathoms or less at low water to a greater depth, as is distinctly shown in the map. In place, however, like this, where the bottom is sand, it is necessary in stormy weathers for ships at anchor to lie with more cable out than when the bottom consists of mud and clay. And it behoves every seaman in a gale of easterly wind, if he is under the painful necessity to bring a ship to anchor in the bay, to be prepared to give her 150 fathoms before he attempts to check and bring her up. Now, 150 fathoms of cable, that's chain. That's about 275 meters of chain. That's an awful lot of weight on a ship. So the more chain you have, the less cargo you can have. And this was maybe 60 years before we had things like plimsoll lines regulating how far down on the water a ship could be. And therefore, this was all sort of seat of the pants navigation, where commercial considerations might overrule health and safety. He goes on then and he says, it is very reprehensible in the conduct of merchant seamen or merchant ships. They seldom have sufficient scope of cable to ride by and frequently have very bad ground tackling. And hence I take the opportunity to observe that underwriters would find it to their advantage when a ship has been stranded, which they were concerned in, if they examined the wreck speedily and narrowly, how she was found in her anchors and cables. For I have seen vessels come into the harbour which, if they had been obliged to anchor in the bay, would have been lost and the insurance paid, although they had not complied with the tenor of the agreement. So I leave Bligh's words there and I'll come back to them shortly. The third expert was Captain Daniel Corneille. Now, Corneille is very interesting because ultimately the problem of Dublin was solved for 103,000 by what the ballast board themselves said. In this whole consultation process, the Directors General asked the ballast board to send in what their idea was, and they then asked Captain Daniel Corneille to evaluate that, to do an assessment of it. Did it make sense? So Corneille took the ballast board's idea, and his first concept was to suggest this wall and these two walls at kind of at an odd angle to each other. He went off and he did more examinations, and at the very end of this 85-page consultation document, we have the sixth of the 6 maps where Corneille has drawn in what the port boards or what the ballast board solution would look like, and he does a cost estimate, and he comes in at £174,000 for this solution. And very decisively, or it should have been decisively, it doesn't seem to have been, but he says in his report, I am persuaded that the idea suggested by the corporation of erecting a pier or embankment from the point of Clontarf sheds to the Spit Buoy would materially improve the entrance into the harbour of Dublin. For their part, the corporation, and the corporation is part of the long name of the ballast board, they had said in correspondence, the works already executed by the corporation have so exhausted their funds as to leave them inadequate to the undertaking of that now recommended. Essentially what had happened was the century-long project to build the Great South Wall was done on a shoestring. They had no real income. They had to beg for money from the corporation. They had no funds. What they had, though, was the correct solution. They had the correct solution. They had no funds. And this expert, Daniel Corneille, confirmed to the Directors General of Inland Navigation, this is the correct solution and it'll work. But that didn't stop John Rennie, the second main canal man involved in this little story. Rennie is the man responsible for building Dún Laoghaire, and he was the engineer who completed the construction of Howth. This is one of 2 maps. It's the first map where he suggests a harbour at Sandy Cove, and he's running a canal all the way back to Grand Canal Dock. There's a second map, and this is the final solution, and it shows all of the elements. Instead of the canal and the harbour at Sandy Cove, he suggests doing it from Dún Laoghaire, which, makes complete sense. It's shorter, therefore it'll be cheaper. He also suggests at Sutton, a harbour with a canal running back to North Lots, and that's pretty similar to what Thomas Hyde Page had talked about. And it's also similar to a suggestion made as long back as 1725 by a guy called John Perry. Now, John Perry had suggested this to the ballast office at the time, and the ballast office rejected it. And there's a great sense in reading the words of John Rennie. He's implicitly very critical of the ballast office for not having gone with the canal solution and having, in his view, wasted a lot of money. And he mentions a figure of upwards of £200,000 in building the Great South Wall. Now, the total solution, so he's got 2 harbours and 2 canals, and he also looks at building a north pier, not unlike what's ultimately built, and then he puts an extension onto that. He puts an extension onto the Great South Wall, and he also runs a great big embankment across South Bull in order to keep sand back. So these are huge amount of engineering works, and he does his costings on them. In this case, he provides costings for the canals, and he comes also to £1.8 million, again, 17 times what the solution to the problem actually required at the end. And here's a lovely quote, I think, from Reddy himself, and he says, "Nature having been so sparing in her bounties, art has been called in to assist her to a greater degree than in any other situation in the United Kingdom which has come under my observation. And notwithstanding the immense amount of money which have been expended on the Port of Dublin," that's a dig at the Ballast Committee for the expense of the Great South Wall, "and which its inhabitants have been able to do by the liberality of the late Irish Parliament." So again, it's just after the Act of Union. And again, he seemed to be quite sniffy about Ireland and this little parliament before the Act of Union. "It is still found very inadequate, and unless it can be improved, the spirited inhabitants of Dublin will be prevented from sharing the commercial advantages of the British Empire." Now, luckily, the Ballast Board got its way eventually and came up with a solution. And here is, I think this is one of the most beautiful maps that we have in our collection. It's a map from Francis Giles from 1819, and the title of it here says, "Plan of the North Bull showing the land purchased and taken by the Corporation for preserving and improving the Port of Dublin, 1819. What seems to have happened is you had this very detailed consultation, and I'm pretty sure it was in about 1802, where Page put forward his canal ideas, Rennie put forward his canal ideas, Bligh said canals are nonsense, and in fact you shouldn't even be working too hard on the bar. It's a waste of time and money. And the Ballast Board itself said, look, we know what the problem is, but we don't have enough money. Their financial circumstances changed over that 17 years. And here is a map which shows the line of the proposed wall. One thing I'd just like to draw your attention to is this sand island. So this is before the North Bull Wall has been built. And this is the Bull Island beginning to form as a result of the Great South Wall. The survey here by Francis Giles from London what formed part of a report that Giles and a guy called George Halpin. Halpin was the inspector of works in the port, and he started in 1800. So the same year that Bligh came to Dublin, George Halpin began. So Halpin now has 19 years of experience. They put a report in to build the North Bull Wall, and that's what happened. The North Bull Wall, the building of it was very interesting because they didn't just build the wall as we see it today. They built an initial 5,500 feet of full height, so the water never went over, and they added 1,500 meters then of half height, so the water would go over. And in 1822, Halpin got Thomas Telford, the railway guy, in, and Telford recommended adding another 500 meters. And every time they added, they just checked to see what was the flow of water out and what effect was it having in the bar. And so it went in dribs and drabs until they got to the length of the wall today. So it ended up being 9,000 feet long, or as I showed earlier in the newer money, 2,700 meters. And that's the story of the consultation and what went on the wall. So I'm going to jump ahead now a number of years to 1881. A wonderful little booklet produced by Isaac John Mann, an assistant engineer. So this is a retrospective look at what happened in Dublin, the Great South Wall, the North Bull Wall, and he also looks at the theories of currents and flows and tides. And they certainly knew how to put titles in books in those days. And this is the full title: River Bars, Notes on the Cause of Their Formation and on Their Treatment by Induced Tidal Scour, with a description of the successful reduction by this method at the bar in Dublin. And in that, he has this a lovely chart. I just explained this. So this is the level of the water at high water. This is the level at low water. And if you imagine the tide flowing out of Dublin Port, through the opening of the Poolbeg Lighthouse and the North Bull Wall Lighthouse, that's the direction of the tide flowing from left to right. So in this chart, man shows the bottom, the profile of the bottom in 1819. He shows that there was 6 feet and 6 inches from low water. Then he shows another survey from 1828, and the top here has been pushed out and also made lower. You now have 9 feet 6 inches. And so on, and 2 further surveys, the bar is being pushed further out to sea and its height is being reduced. 1873, you get to what is really the ultimate. So this is the most that Dublin's version of that Congo River surge I showed. This is as much as it could attain, but it's very significant in the terms of what Dublin had. And here's 2 charts that Mann has in his book, and this is just showing the attention to detail from the survey, the height at the bar, the number of years, the increase, so on. And he comes then to this very simple conclusion. Between 1819 and 1873, the average rate of increase in the depth of the bar was a little over 2 inches per annum. Now, Mann also then looked at what were the impacts of that in terms of trade, and he produces this chart showing the aggregate tonnage of shipping in the port over a 70-year period. And he looks at 5-year averages. And interesting, that's exactly what we're doing today. When we look at long-term planning, we look at averages of cargo tons over 5 years. And you see here a huge increase in cargo, and it is 4 or 5-fold. It's about 5-fold, if I remember correctly, but it's about 2.2% growth on average each year. Coincidentally, we're planning on a growth rate at the moment of, not quite coincident, but a bit more, about 3.3% per annum. And I think what I find amazing from this is, here we are at the start of the 19th century, and there we're looking at growth, this compounding annual growth, at a not too dissimilar level that we are planning on today. We're looking overall at a 90-year period of up to 2040. So the problems they had then are very similar to the problems we have now. They were looking to cater for growth. They had huge engineering works to do that took them about 20 years to get started on. Likewise, we're planning now in 2020 for what's going to happen in 20 years' time. And Mann, in his paper, he summarizes it very succinctly. He looks at all of the experts, and he summarizes in a way that I've now done, but maybe a bit more articulately than me. And he says, the expensive and elaborate schemes for the improvement of Dublin Harbour, which have been enumerated, although emanating from some of the highest engineering and nautical authorities of the time, were ultimately superseded by the much simpler expedient of a northern pier or great north wall. And that's the price that it was done for. So, getting towards the end, if you stand back and look at this kind of 25-year period, between the North Bull Wall and the piers in Dunleary and the ones on Holt, there was about 10 kilometres of quay walls built in a few decades in the early 19th century. The starting point, as I mentioned earlier, was Captain Bligh. He arrived in Dublin in 1800. He was here for 3 or 4 months, from September to December, maybe to January. And he lived until he was 63. He died in 1817. He did a survey when he was only 46. Now, what I think is amazing about Bligh is he already, 11 years before that, had the mutiny on the Bounty. So he was only 35 years of age. The following year, after doing a survey in Dublin, he commanded a ship under Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen. An immense amount in a relatively young man in his career. The important thing, though, Bull Wall was built. It only started in 1819, 2 years after Bligh died. So Bligh didn't recommend the North Bull Wall, as we know today, and construction on it started after he died. The second interesting date is 1807. And there was this horrendous loss of life at sea. Prince of Wales and Rochdale, in one night, the 19th of November, went aground. One of them at Sea Point at the Martello Tower, where a kid would have learned to swim, and the other one a little further down the coast at Blackrock. 380 lives were lost. I just think it's an extraordinary thing to imagine all of those bodies strewn over the seashore in an area which for us is just all about leisure today. And they were buried in a number of locations. There's a group of victims buried just behind the Applegreen station, beside the Tower of Towers Hotel, and there's more graves out in the cemetery on Carrickbrennan Road. Howth Harbour was completed in 1813, and the motivation there was to provide a safe harbour where a packet station, mail packet facility could be, to allow the mail to move between Ireland and England. And that was a station that ran from 1818 to 1833. Now, Howth wasn't particularly successful. They had a lot of silting problems. Dún Laoghaire was built between 1870 and 1842, and ultimately all of the packet services to Liverpool and so on went into Dún Laoghaire. And in the end, it was only the packet service to Holyhead, which to those of us of a certain age will remember the old mailboat. And then 1819 to 1824, Bullwall built, again going into the new money, deepened from 2 metres to 4.9 metres. Today we have 7.8 metres, and we're on course to bringing Dublin, the channel in Dublin, to 10 metres deep. And that'll be the ultimate depth. That'll be the last development in Dublin in terms of the channel. So just to conclude with some thoughts, if I think about Captain Bligh and his advice to insurers to look at cables and anchors and stuff, and you think about Rochdale and Prince of Wales, had Bligh been listened to, would those ships have been lost? He's quite clear in his mind, with the correct amount, 275 metres, I think I said earlier, you'd be able to bring your ship to rest. Maybe Rochdale and Prince of Wales weren't doing what Bligh had said, and maybe that's why they were lost. Between 1802 and 1819, nothing much happened, and if the Directors General of Inland Navigation and the Corporation for Preserving, that's the Ballast Board, had they been more decisive in their thinking, might the problem of Dublin's bar been resolved much sooner? In particular, if Thomas Hyde Page, if it wasn't just hot air, if 100,000, so 1 year of the money that he said you could get no problem from the Parliament, the United Parliament of England and Ireland, that would have been enough to implement the solution that the Ballast Board knew about, and that had been recommended by Cornelia, but it didn't happen. So if those two things had happened, would the impetus to build Dún Laoghaire have been a great? I think it's safe to assume no, it wouldn't have been, because Dún Laoghaire really was built as a reaction to the loss of Rochdale and the Prince of Wales. And if it wasn't as urgent, might even the need for it have diminished as the situation in Dublin Port improved and as the era of the steamship loomed, and similarly would Howth have been built. So if Captain Bligh had been listened, my conclusion is that if Bligh had been listened to, and if the Directors General had been able to take a decision and help the Ballast Board get the money from Parliament or whatever, we wouldn't have a Howth Harbour today, and we wouldn't have a Dún Laoghaire Harbour, and the bay would be very different. And my only overall conclusion, what do you learn from looking back? In our case, I think we're learning an awful lot. The sort of problems and challenges they had then are almost identical in nature to the problems we have today. That website I showed you earlier, there's a series of papers on that. There's 5 at the moment, 2 more to come. And we look at the challenge of building new port facilities to have them ready in 20 years' time, about the same period of time that it took to get the North Bull Wall built. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of it. So I'm going to hand back, I think, to Mary. And if there's any questions, I'd be delighted to attempt to answer them.
Thank you very much, Eamon. That was absolutely riveting and fascinating. Tom obviously thought the same as I did. He's just completing an MPhil in UCC on the Port of Cork. And he raises an interesting question about, he said, one interesting conclusion is how the Harbour Authority there had a very successful financial period during the famine, the reason being the emigrant shipping being a financial success. Do you have any thoughts on a similar situation in Dublin? I know there wouldn't have been the same numbers emigrating.
Yeah, I'm no expert on the Port of Cork, but there is, I need to remember now, I think there's a fabulous history I read. I think it was written by Trevor West, the old maths professor in Trinity, where he looks at the trading through the Port of Cork of grain and feeds and so on. The impression I have, and as I said, I'm no expert, Cork was a very wealthy city and trading port because of that agricultural trades. And if Cork had a lot of money because of that, that doesn't surprise me. Dublin really does seem to have, certainly in the 18th century, they didn't seem to have a bean to rub together. And for an awful long part of the history of the port authorities in Dublin, it really was hand to mouth to try to get the money together for investment. And it's only I would say in the last 10 years that we've now been in a position, we just announced last December, for example, we've just raised 300 million euros to continue to build the infrastructure we need that is needed for between now and 2040, let alone going on beyond that. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that Port of Cork was ahead of the Port of Dublin, perhaps in its financial capability.
You have quite a few compliments here as well. Robert was wondering where along the Liffey would the sailing ships have discharged?
The sailing ships, the map I showed at the very beginning from 1704, that's Capel Street. So in the early 1700s, they were going up to Capel Street. The canalisation of the Liffey really would have happened. I might get my dates wrong, so any historians watching, don't be too hard on me, please. But the Liffey was canalised all the way down. John Rogerson's Quay, for example, would have been built, if I remember correctly, around 1880. So the sailing ships were going very far upriver. And as the ships got bigger, and as the need for bridges became apparent as the city grew, they moved progressively to the east. So I'll give you a practical example. If you think of Butt Bridge, that originally was the Beresford Swing Bridge. So when the Beresford Swing Bridge was built, ships were going up as far as O'Connell Bridge, and that was about in the 1880s as well. And then the Loop Line Bridge went in for the railway, and that meant they could only go up as far as what is the old Custom House now. So the sailing ships were using the quays all up and down. I think in Ulysses, you'll find that they're all up around O'Connell Bridge, that sort of area.
Okay, Donal has remarked that Cork was central to the wine trade with Bordeaux in the 17th and 18th centuries. Could explain some of the wealth as well. Jane said, it was fascinating. Susan, yeah, sorry, I'm just skimming through those. Adrian was saying how fascinated and so astonished she was that the amounts of money which were being quoted in relation to the suggested alterations.
Sorry, and it's no different nowadays. One of the exercises that we're doing in this Dublin Port post 2040, we've actually done a costing to move Dublin Port to another location and to free up the lands here for development, for housing. Now, I'm not going to tell you today what the figure is, that will be coming out on October the 12th, but it's similarly mad money involved compared to the mad money that Thomas Hyde Page and John Rennie thought should be spent to solve a problem that could have been dealt with much more simply. So we are seeing today very similar types of occurrences as you would have seen 200 years ago, where eminent people make suggestions for amounts of money which are totally unnecessary. And the really important thing is to have analysis and dialogue. And that, I think, was one of the great achievements of the Directors General consultation process. I think I'd love to have the time to do more research and to understand why it ran into the sand for 17 years. but at least you've this coherent set of papers with conflicting and different ideas. So if it was inconclusive, at least all of the material and the different ideas are there.
Susan is wondering, was there a small dock next to the Customs House before George's Dock was built?
You've got me there. If I start to make any comments, I'm quite likely to get it entirely wrong. So I'm going to play safe on that one. Apologies.
Very wise. Actually, a couple of people have asked if you could show the slide with the website address again. If you could display that, it would be the one to follow up.
Stop sharing for a moment. So
okay.
I don't get
Now, here's a really interesting one while you're looking for that. Naomi wonders, could you comment on smuggling via Sandycove? When she was at her childhood home in Sandycove, there was a strange hump in the back garden. And when she'd asked her mother about it, she was told there was an old smuggler's tunnel. It was at an angle and probably led to what's now Sandycove Baths. Her home was on the main road, 1 block from the seafront. I know that's outside the direct port area, but have you ever heard anything about any of that?
No, I haven't, but I can tell you that on August the 25th, I was in for a swim in Sandycove and someone stole my coat. The coat with my car keys and a few bits and pieces. No, I'm sorry, I don't know. I mean, certainly there would have been a lot of smuggling all up and down the coast. That was an industry of the time. And is there an industry about to make a comeback in 3 months' time? Who knows?
Okay. Yes, Susan said she's going to do a tour of the Docklands and she thought she'd read something about it. So Noel is wondering where we're going with rising sea levels.
That is really one of the great imponderables. What we have some, nobody can give a simple answer to that other than that sea levels are going to go up and there's going to be more extreme weather events. What we are doing at the moment, we have some very detailed studies being done by the best experts in the country on currents, wave patterns, etc., and doing modelling with higher levels of sea to see what the impacts of that would be on the North Pole Wall and on the Great South Wall. So rather than trying to answer the very general question, which is so huge, it's very hard to get your hands around, we're looking very specifically at the impact of potential sea level rise, different levels on those two structures to see what might need to be done. Once we do that, I think we bring ourselves into the whole subject of sea level rise in a very real way. I think everybody is concerned about it. And I think the types of projections being made, you look at those projections and you'd almost give up hope. I think it's far better to come at this from a scientific perspective, look at those particular assets, start to understand what the problem is there. And from that, I think we'll start to build a level of expertise available to others to start also then thinking about what happens around Sandymount, Clontarf and so on. It will have to be an all of Dublin Bay solution. I think that's clear. Where we are building new areas within the port and where we're able to do it, we're putting them up by about 1.5 meters. Lots of the stuff that we're building at the moment, you have to tie into existing levels and that can't be done. But we're doing everything within the limits that are prescribed, if you like, at the moment. Whether those limits have to be changed in the future is a real risk, but it's not actually a risk, it's just pure uncertainty. We just don't know, and that's the problem.
Okay, and what maintenance is being carried out at present, if any?
Maintenance on the channel?
The general area you've been talking about, I presume.
If we look at the two walls, every year we do a very detailed examination with a technique called LiDAR. And with LiDAR, you can detect movements of a few centimeters. Actually, I'll just do a plug for an academic from UCD, Beth Schott. Beth Schott has done some wonderful studies on harbours around the country, including on Bullock, using LiDAR, where she makes a virtual model of a harbour and compares that to old paintings, drawings, etc. And it gives you a wonderful insight into how the place was built, what the sequence of it was, etc. In our case, we use the LiDAR to detect movements, any movements at all. The amount of maintenance we do is minimal. It's very difficult to do maintenance on the Great South Wall because it's a protected structure. And we do have practical structure of working in such a structure, Bullock Harbour. So anybody from out the Dún Laoghaire area might have seen over the last couple of years a lot of work on repairing the quay wall there. It basically started to drop down, and we had to do a lot of rebuilding of a protected heritage structure. So we've developed a lot of expertise of working with a protected structure. We know how we would have to set about doing repairs on the Great South Wall if we had to do them. And the LiDAR tells us whether it's moving or not and whether works are required. We do have to do some works, and we've gone through all the necessary regulatory consents to allow us to do it. We do need to fix some holes in the Great South Wall. It is a hazardous place to walk, given the nature of it. It's like walking in the Wicklow Mountains. So we will be doing some very minor repairs, mostly from a health and safety perspective, but we don't have any major repairs required on the Great South Wall or indeed the North Pole Wall for structural integrity purposes.
And what about cruise liners in the future?
Who knows? We had one this year. There won't be any for the rest of the year. I doubt very much at the moment will we see cruise ships running in Europe the way they have in the past. So I just don't know. Our approach will be very simple. We won't let any cruise ships in until the government say it's okay. And even at that point, we will do risk assessments with the likes of the HSE from the point of view of infectious diseases. COVID, it highlighted weaknesses, if you like, in systems everywhere, whether it was old people's homes or cruise ships or theatres or cinemas or pubs. There's just, again, huge uncertainty. I just don't know what the future holds. From our point of view, though, once it is possible for the cruise industry to get back up, and we'll take in as many as we can. We're building an awful lot of berths. They're very, very expensive to build. If we can generate good revenue from them, we will definitely get as many in as we can.
And just we've time for the one last question, definitely. This one really relates to your planning for the future and how a no-deal Brexit might affect it.
Yeah, it's our challenge. We're dealing with a really serious issue currently in COVID. Another one which is going to hit in 3 months' time. At the same time, we're building projects that take about 3 to 4 to 5 years to build. We have planning permission for more projects over a 15-year time horizon, and we're already today starting to look at 2040. What needs to be built to be ready for then? So the short answer, at one level, Brexit is entirely irrelevant in the long run for Dublin Port. In the short run, however, we did get very active a couple of years ago, and we spent about 30 million euros making facilities available for state agencies, state services like the revenue, agriculture, food and marine, and so on. So we have all of that in place, and there's a lot of very detailed operational things happening now by revenue, ag, food and marine, the guards, in order to be ready for Brexit. But quite what is going to happen on the 1st of January, I just don't know. Nobody knows. I think that's the truth. Will there be an 11th hour deal? Who knows? Will there be this sudden landing of tariffs and quotas and reduction in volumes of trade? That could happen too. But in the case of Dublin, we're fortunate insofar as we've built a lot of infrastructure, which has allowed a lot of additional services directly to continental Europe. Some of you may remember a couple of years ago, we christened a ship called Celine. The Irish Times called it the Brexit Buster. I think it filled the whole of an RTE news episode at 6 o'clock. And that one ship has 8,000 meters of lanes to put trailers onto. Takes about 600 units of freight. So we have seen an enormous increase in the capacity of shipping between here and continental Europe. But quite what is going to happen, all I can say is I think Dublin Port Company, the shipping lines, revenue, ag, food, I think everybody is as ready as they possibly can be. Whether that is sufficient on the day because you cannot test for this, remains to be seen. It is going to be difficult if things go as badly in the negotiations as we seem to be seeing at the moment.
Thank you very much. I know that was a bit outside the scope of your talk, but probably an obvious answer or an obvious question at the moment.
I suppose it's as relevant to us today as the Battle of Waterloo was when they were thinking of getting ready for the North Pole Wall.
Absolutely, yes. Well, thank you for this really marvellous talk. I'm glad it's being recorded because I think it will definitely repay listening to again. You've so much detail and fascinating information. If anybody wants to hear any other events over the next few days, there are still some tickets left. You can get the information at the Dublin Festival of History.ie website and on the various social media channels. But again, Eamonn, thank you so much. And thank you to all the members of the audience for participating. And we hope to see you again at some stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much.